Oh, hi everyone. This is a drawing that I did over Christmas of a Muntjac deer. This photo I purchased over at Wildlife Reference Photos. It is a beautiful reference photo, really nice detail, the lighting, the pose, it was just really nice to work from. The 3.5-hour version of this is available over on Patreon, so if you would like to follow along with that tutorial, there is a link in the description below, and obviously you will have to head over to Wildlife Reference Photos to buy that photograph if you would like to follow along to this tutorial. Now, this drawing was something that I completed over Christmas just gone. It was because it seems a bit of a random subject to draw, but my husband showed an interest in drawing. He'd never done any kind of art before, and I was really excited to see what he could create. So I speak about that over in the Patreon video and show his version of as a complete beginner and areas where he struggled with that, and then how I showed him to use better techniques and get your base layers correct and so on. But the biggest thing to remember for someone completely new to any kind of art, regardless of the medium, is you need to draw something that you have an interest in. There would be no good in me asking my husband to draw a rose, for instance, because that's not what he's interested in. I gave him complete free choice of what he'd like to draw. Now, the Muntjac deer, which is what this is here, is one of his favourite animals. So we headed over to Wildlife Reference Photos because they're quite difficult to get good photos of this animal. So that's why we headed over there and found this reference photo, and straight away he liked it. So that is a really good starting point for anyone who's new to art, who wants to get into it, is draw something that you have a interest in, that you're passionate about, because that will make the learning process so much easier. So I'd had quite a lot of comments on my YouTube videos asking me to set up Patreon and do online tutorials, and it was something that I never had the confidence to do. I never dreamed that I would actually go ahead and set up Patreon, but it was only when my husband sat down and did this drawing, I was able to give him 10 minutes of pointers on how to improve, and then he redid the drawing. And I saw that noticeable improvement and how happy and pleased he was with the finished portrait that he had achieved. From someone who had never picked up any kind of art supply before, he was quite shocked at what he could create. He's someone who really struggles to sit down to do anything. You know, he's always wanting to do something, DIY, gardening, anything like that. So to just sit down, get in that art bubble that we often like to be in, we completely just get engrossed in that moment of what we're doing. He did not realise that he was going to enjoy it so much, and that gave me that like spurred me on to want to go ahead and do this Patreon channel, and I am loving it. I just want to thank you all for your support. It is really so very much appreciated. So these videos here that I share on YouTube are considerably sped up, but you can still see how much I'm moving my hand, how I'm positioning my hand, and where I'm holding it on the pencil. That is all deliberate, because depending on all of those things and also how much pressure you put on that pencil, you're going to get a different first stroke. The pastel pencils are very much like a paintbrush. Depending on how much pressure you put, you're going to get different thickness in your lines, you're going to get more colour pigment come out from that pencil, and so on. So depending on how you want to get fine soft fur or maybe wiry coarser fur, you will be using that pencil in a different way, and it's something that I cover quite in depth in all of my Patreon tutorials, because it's something that I find that's really quite important. And it became more noticeable when I was observing parts of what my husband was drawing with this Muntjac on his version. He was holding his pencil right at the closest point of the lead and putting quite a lot of pressure on that pencil. He was therefore creating short and really thick fur strokes, which for something like any animal really, you want it to be the opposite. You want it to have nice fine details, nice soft looking in that fur, especially if we are drawing something like this. We want there to be lots and lots of fur detail that we can see, creating depth with each layer that we are adding. And because of how he was holding the pencil, that's something that he found quite challenging. So this is something that I cover a lot, and I explain why I'm moving my hand and why I've got my hand positioned in that way, why I'm holding that pencil in that specific way, because it's not random. It's there for a reason, to get that specific fur stroke that I'm after. Now also, this portrait I just did the entire process with pastel pencils alone. There was not any soft pastel sticks or pan pastels at all. The reason for that is I wanted to keep this as simple as I could, because I didn't want to complicate things and try and add more materials for my husband to get a little bit more confused with. I think sometimes when you're starting out with any medium, regardless of what it is, the more supplies and the more colours you have in front of you, the more harder it can get. The one thing that he struggled with was colour selection. What pencil do I pick up? So I only gave him 20 pencils, and that is all he used to create his version. As soon as I limited his colour choice, he found it much easier to pick up the pencils and progress through the portrait. When I gave him my entire selection of pencils, and I use Carbothello, Pitt, Derwent and Caran, he couldn't actually do the drawing because he was too stuck on what he should be, the colour that he should be selecting. He was too worried that he was going to do something wrong. The second that I took all those pencils away, and as I say, I only gave him 20, he was able to actually sit down and do the drawing. And his version of the portrait is explained over in the Patreon version. And the photos there showing his very first attempt and the second attempt after I showed him how to do his base layers a little bit more effectively, and how better to try and work on adding some of those fur direction details. And from this drawing here, you can see how soft I'm able to get the fur. It looks really quite dense. It's got that nice flow to it. That's because I've worked from dark layers and building my light layers on top, but also it's how I'm using the pencil. It's really important in creating that softness in that fur. Now, when you're working on areas such as the nose, like what I am here, this nose is quite unique to this animal, to this species. It doesn't look like a normal nose that we might typically be used to drawing, such as a dog and a cat. If you're struggling with any part of your portrait and it doesn't make sense, it's something that you're finding that you are just stuck on, turn your drawing and your artwork, your reference photo, upside down, and your brain will be forced to see them as abstract shapes rather than a nose or whatever it is that you might be stuck on. It just really does help. So just turn everything around the other way. Once you've done that area, turn it all back and it will actually look like the reference photo, and it will be much, much easier to tackle. One of the biggest tips that I can give anybody who wants to try and get realistic fur is build up on your layers. It's really easy to only do 3 or 4 layers and try to expect to get that level of depth and realism in the fur. But realistically, it needs to have multiple layers, far more than that, in order to achieve that depth. You'll notice that when I'm doing some of my pencil strokes and the details, they hardly show up, but that is deliberate, and I speak about that a lot in this video throughout the entire process, because sometimes it looks like a wasted step because you can hardly see those details. But it's not until you start adding the lighter layers and the lighter details on top that that subtle layer underneath, which you might have thought was a little bit pointless, actually starts to come into its own because you add in even more depth. We're trying to work from the fur that's closest to the skin and build up to what's closest to the viewer. The fur that you would be able to touch first if you were to be stroking this animal, or any subject that you are drawing, needs to be drawn last. That is the closest to the viewer, the fur that's on the very top. And that is the case when you're working with pastels, because we do have the benefit of being able to layer light over dark. If you're working in colour pencils, as you know, that is much, much harder to do, and you have to work in the opposite way. You have to work from light to dark because you can't as easily put your lighter colours on top of your dark. It makes it much more limiting with how you can layer. That's why I moved over to pastels from colour pencils, because having that ability to layer your light over dark, how you do naturally see it in the reference photo, I personally think I'm able to get a bit more realism in my pastel work than I am my colour pencil, but that is just my personal preference. And you'll notice here from this drawing that I'm making sure I get my lights and my darks accurate. That's really important in making sure you get that realism and that more of that 3D effect. We don't want the artwork to look flat, so we want to make sure we get our darks as dark as we possibly need to be. Now you'll see that his left eye is much darker than the stripe in the middle on the bridge of the nose. That is to make it more 3D. If I was to have everything on the same value and the same level, it's not going to appear as realistic. You'll see when we get down to the neck part, where I blur that out, it makes the face appear far more 3D, far more like it's closer to the viewer, and that's the illusion that I wanted to create by deliberately blurring out that neck. And on the other hand, you'll notice that my highlights are only in certain areas. If you look at the tuft of fur in the middle between the two black stripes, that's the brightest part of the fur. The tufts and clumps of fur on the left side of the face, I've only put highlights in certain areas to make sure I replicate that clumped fur effect. And even though in my Patreon video and throughout this tutorial I'll tell you exactly what colour pencil I'm using, and you've got a full material list as well, the colour is not as important as your contrasts. If this cloud had gone over the sun and this photographer had taken another photo of this animal a split second later, the colour and the white balance would be completely different, but the animal would still look realistic. This animal could be under any colour artificial lighting for whatever reason. Let's say it was under blue lighting for whatever random reason it might be. This animal would be blue in colour, but you would still be able to make it realistic because your values would be correct. Your lights would be as light as they need to be and your darks would be as dark as they need to be. But the fur would still look realistic. And regardless to the tutorial that you might be following, or you might be watching a YouTube video online, if you don't know the exact colour that that artist is using, just pick up something similar. Your finished portrait will be close. It will still look like that tutorial, but don't ever feel like you can't follow along with anyone's video because you don't have exactly the same brand or exactly the same supplies that they have. You really can still create something just as nice. And that's why in my Patreon videos I will reference the actual number that comes on the pencil, but I will also say it is a burnt sienna type colour or a yellow ochre type colour, so that someone following along who doesn't have that exact pencil knows roughly what other pencil in their set to pick up of a different brand. So it really is a combination of finding a balance between knowing whether or not you need to pick a colour that is warmer or cooler on the colour wheel, but also the value, how light that colour is and how dark that colour is. And also going back to the supply list, that's why on my Patreon channel I try and mix up projects that are just using pastel pencils alone. I've got some there that are with the pan pastels as a base layer, and I've also got some where it's the sanded soft pastel sticks, which is my preference. I've got a mixture of all, so that if someone doesn't have all of the same supplies, you can still follow along and know that you can create something pretty much the same or very, very close. Now when it comes to working on the chest here, I'm using a oval shaped soft tool, and I am using a very small amount of sanded soft pastel sticks to create this soft blurred effect into the Pastelmat paper. If I was to be using the pencils for this, you'll run the risk of actually... You can blend out the pastel pencil strokes to a degree, but because I wanted this to be exceptionally soft and really blended out, that was why I chose to use a little bit of the soft pastel sticks, which I'd sanded down on a bit of fine grit sandpaper, and then applied that pigment with the soft tool. As you saw throughout this video, that is the only time I've used that method, and it was just because I wanted to create a really soft effect. And here you'll see that I am still making sure that I put all that detail at the top portion of the neck, but I'm fading out and dispersing these details the lower down the faded section I get, to make sure that I am creating that illusion that we're gradually fading our subject out. So I hope this video was of use. If you would like to get notified of future content, don't forget to hit the bell and the subscribe button, and then you should get notified of future content. And if you would like to see the full 3.5-hour version of this, follow along should you want to. I'll put the link to my Patreon channel below, and also on my website I have a Patreon library which lists all of the tutorials that is available over on Patreon, so that you can see exactly what content I've got over there before signing up. So thank you very much for watching. As always, it's very much appreciated, and I will be uploading again soon.